Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 5th annual John Antcliffe Lecture. My name is Jason Sharman. I'm head of the Department of Politics and International Studies. I'm here to say a few words first off about John Antcliffe and then to briefly introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Saunders. John Antcliffe read history at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. He was also head of the Conservative Students' Union Association here at Cambridge. He was a local government member for Greenwich and a public relations professional in London. Previous John Antcliffe Memorial lecturers have been Patience Wheatcroft, Tristram Hunt, Peter Hennessy. Also, the John Antcliffe Memorial Foundation supports 3 Bye-Fellows at Churchill College. I'm pleased to say that we have these in the audience, Tom Hurst, Stephen Meredith, and Tom Kelsey. To our speaker tonight, we're very pleased to have Dr. Robert Saunders, a lecturer in modern British history at Queen's University, London. He's previously taught at the University of Oxford, and he's published 2 books and edited collections, his most recent one being Yes to Europe, the 1975 referendum and 70s Britain, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, and picked by New Statesman of one of the books of the year. And as you can see, Dr. Saunders is speaking to us tonight about 30 Years On, Margaret Thatcher, 1989, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Saunders.
Thank you very much. Well, it's very good to be at Cambridge today on this beautiful day. Perhaps you might think it's strangely appropriate that there is thunder and lightning on a day when I'm talking about Margaret Thatcher and Germany. But thank you for coming. And I also want to thank the family of John Antcliffe and Jason and Peter for the chance to give this lecture and the chance to pay my respects to the memory of John Antcliffe. What I want to do this evening is to take you back in time. So I want to dial back the clock almost exactly 30 years. To one of the most astonishing and inspiring and moving years of modern European history. At the start of 1989, the map of Europe looked much as it had done since the end of the Second World War. So this was a continent that was divided into 2 armed camps, that was separated militarily, economically, and ideologically. The Iron Curtain, identified by Winston Churchill in 1946, still ran from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. And nowhere was that division more visible than in the Great Wall that cut through the heart of Berlin, really the black gates of Cold War Europe. Now, by the end of the year, and certainly by the end of 1990, that world had changed beyond recognition. So across Eastern Europe, communist regimes had either collapsed or had been swept aside. Within a few short years, the Soviet Union itself and the Warsaw Pact would have ceased to exist. And this was the fall not just of an empire, but of an entire world order. And I'm sure that everyone in this room who's my age or above can remember watching these events transfixed, unfolding on the television. And the moment that I think really brought home just what a revolutionary year this was the 9th of November and the days that followed, when the Berlin Wall first opens and was then dismantled. Within a year, the 2 Germanys had united. Within a few weeks, David Hasselhoff was using this as his stage, so it wasn't all progress. Now, one of those who was watching on television on the 9th of November, possibly with cocktail glass in hand, was Margaret Thatcher. More than any other British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher's politics were forged in the Cold War. She had made her reputation as leader of the opposition in the 1970s as the Iron Lady of the West, and that was a nickname that was given to her by a Soviet newspaper. She had been a fierce critic of détente. She had formed a very close relationship with Ronald Reagan. In 1988, she had crossed the Iron Curtain to visit the Solidarity movement in Poland. She was, of course, always someone who thought very carefully about what she wore and what signals her costume sent out. and she made a point of wearing green as a symbol of commitment to Polish freedom. And if Margaret Thatcher had one fundamental political principle, it was a hatred of communism and of socialism. And for Thatcher, the free market was not simply economically superior, it was also morally and ethically superior. She was convinced that you could not be free under a planned socialist economy. So in all those respects, we might think that the implosion of communism, the creation of a united Germany that was firmly anchored in NATO and in the Western Alliance, would have been the crowning moment of Margaret Thatcher's career. Instead, it became her biggest foreign policy failure. And that's not my judgment, that is hers. This is what she has to say in her memoirs. If there is one instance in which a foreign policy I pursued met with unambiguous failure, it was my policy on German reunification. And it was a failure that left her weakened internationally, that left her more isolated in Britain, and that may have contributed to her fall at the end of 1990. So what I want to do today is to think about why. Why was she so hostile to German reunification? Why did a Prime Minister who had generally been quite sure-footed diplomatically struggle so badly in this particular crisis? And then I also want to think about what this might tell us about Thatcherism, about the relationship between Thatcherism and its times, and about what the legacy of this might have been for British conservatism. So let's just start by dialing back the clock and putting this in context. (1989) was a very difficult moment for the Thatcher government. It was Margaret Thatcher's 10th anniversary in power. You can see here the idea of the first 10 years. But it was also a time when, as one of her MPs put it, a lot of fires were burning. I apologise for giving you statistics before dinner, but just to give you an indication, if we think about the economy, inflation was spiking towards 10%. To deal with that, interest rates rose to 15%. Now, high interest rates, of course, are terrible news if you are a homeowner with a mortgage. And one of Margaret Thatcher's great achievements as Prime Minister had been to extend home ownership through the sale of council houses. 1989 was also a bad year for strikes. In particular, the government became embroiled in a very damaging dispute with ambulance workers. This was in the days when Ken Clarke was a slightly less cuddly public figure. So if we think about the signature achievements of the Thatcher era, taming inflation, spreading home ownership, calming industrial relations, all three of these seem to be in retreat. That's before we even get to the poll tax, or as nobody ever called it, the community charge. The poll tax was the single biggest policy blunder of the 1980s. It famously triggered riots in London, but much more importantly, it triggered a revolt among Tory electoral support. At by-elections, at the European elections, and in the opinion polls, the Conservative Party seemed to be hemorrhaging support. If we look at the polls at the start of 1989, the Conservative Party was about 7 points ahead of Labour. By the end of 1989, Labour had a double-digit lead. So electorally, things were looking very difficult. We could add to that a war in the cabinet. For much of the 1980s, the central axis of Thatcherism had been these three: the alliance between Margaret Thatcher, Geoffrey Howe, and Nigel Lawson. By 1989, they were at daggers drawn. Geoffrey Howe was demoted from the Foreign Office in the summer. Nigel Lawson would resign acrimoniously later in the year. So the core alliance that carried Thatcherism through its first 2 terms in power had broken to pieces. And that also meant that there was nobody really left in cabinet who had the kind of weight that meant that they could challenge Thatcher's judgment. She was, however, challenged for the leadership. Her challenger in 1989 was not exactly a household name. I think nobody would have been more surprised than Sir Anthony Mayer if he had accidentally become Prime Minister. And on the face of it, he was very comfortably beaten. 314 votes, to 33. But if you add to that total the number who had spoiled their ballots, or who had simply not voted at all, 60 members of Mrs. Thatcher's party had not backed her in a contest against a no-hoper candidate. And Sir George Younger, who ran her leadership campaign, warned her that the result is not as good as the figures, that she will be vulnerable the next year if a challenge recurred. And there's a very telling comment, I think, from one of her whips, Tristan Garrell-Jones, in a post-mortem after the contest, in which he said, "We are talking about the beginning of the end of the Thatcher era." And when they talked about the discontents that were boiling in the Conservative Party, 3 complaints recur again and again. 1, Margaret Thatcher's growing Euroscepticism in a party that was still broadly pro-European. 2, the influence of her private secretary and foreign policy guru, Charles Powell. And 3, a personal style which seemed to be increasingly imperious. And all 3 of those concerns would be a big part of the story about Germany. So what we've got here is a Prime Minister who was firefighting at home, but she was also under growing pressure abroad. In January 1989, one of the great love affairs of modern diplomacy came to an end. Ronald Reagan saddled up and rode off into the sunset. His successor, George Bush, did not share his predecessor's fondness for the Thatcher handbag. In fact, he wrote in his diary that she was a very difficult woman, that she talks all the time when you're in a conversation. It's a one-way street. Now, the differences weren't just temperamental. Bush also made very clear in public that he saw West Germany, rather than the United Kingdom, as America's partner in leadership in Europe. And that meant that it was very difficult, it was more difficult than it had been in the past, for Thatcher to amplify her influence by means of the special relationship. Relations were also poor with West Germany, and especially with its long-standing Chancellor, Helmut Kohl. And if you look at their memoirs, you can see them almost trading insults. So Thatcher talks about the acrimonious discussions that they've been having over nuclear weapons. Kohl calls her ice cold and dangerous. And again, this wasn't just about personality. One of Britain's big cards in terms of influence with West Germany was the military commitment it made to its defence, the British Army stationed in West Germany. But of course, as tensions with the Soviet Union declined, so that became a diminishing asset. She got on rather better with the French president, François Mitterrand, even if in this picture they look like they're about to pace out a duel. Mitterrand famously said of Mrs. Thatcher, "She has the eyes of Caligula, but the lips of Marilyn Monroe." But they were further apart politically, and in the summer of 1989, when France was celebrating the bicentenary of the French Revolution, she made some particularly ill-judged remarks about the insignificance and bloodthirstiness of the revolutionary tradition. So relations there were not warm either. Now, all of this might have mattered less if there had been a stronger voice coming out of the Foreign Office. The problem was that by October 1989, Margaret Thatcher was on her 3rd Foreign Secretary in 3.5 months. Howe had been moved in the summer, John Major had lasted a couple of months. Douglas Hurd would become, of course, a very formidable Foreign Secretary. His influence would grow over the course of 1990. But on the day that the Berlin Wall fell, he had been in post for 2 weeks. And what that meant is that there was really nobody who could play the kind of role that Peter Carrington had played in an earlier crisis over Rhodesia, earlier in the 1980s. It would be Margaret Thatcher's rhetoric and her language that would echo around Europe. So why was her rhetoric on Germany so negative? Why do cartoons like this start to appear in the German press? So here she is with Dennis in her Union Jack bedspread, dreaming of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and she's saying, "Darling, I had the most terrible dream." Why did even the Daily Mail which was a strongly pro-Thatcher paper, attack what it called her sour attitude and megaphone diplomacy on Germany. I think there are three main answers to that question, so I'll just work through each of them in turn. The first big problem was simply the pace of change. Thatcher, of course, did not have the luxury of hindsight. She didn't get to stand on a stage in the Winstanley Theatre 30 years later knowing that everything would work out. She was in the middle of a cascade of constantly changing events. It's a time when things that seemed impossible on one day became yesterday's news on the next. And it's striking, I think, that on the day that the Berlin Wall opened, Chancellor Kohl was actually in Poland. So every government was behind the curve on this. And what that meant was that the possibility of disaster was always very high. More than once in the past, reform movements in Eastern Europe had been rolled back by the Soviet Union. Famously, of course, in Hungary in 1956 and Prague in 1968. Even in 1989, earlier that summer, Chinese tanks had rolled into Tiananmen Square. So there was a reminder here that an authoritarian communist regime could kick back again. And the shadow of Tiananmen Square it hangs very heavily over Thatcher's correspondence in the second half of 1989. That reminds us of something I think is easily forgotten about Margaret Thatcher, though of course it's very obvious, which is that she was always fundamentally a conservative. She was somebody who was quite wary of instability and somebody who was quite suspicious of uncontrolled change. And she had very little patience with the kind of very visionary rhetoric that was coming especially out of the United States. Many of you will be familiar with Francis Fukuyama and his famous article published in 1989, which he then turned into a book, on the end of history. And he talked about how what we might be witnessing was not simply the end of the Cold War, but the end of history as such, the universalization of Western liberal democracy. Now, Margaret Thatcher read that article very carefully. She annotated it in detail. There's a wonderful bit where he talks about how the future of international relations would be the common marketization of diplomacy, and her pen nearly falls off the page at that point with horror. And she took very seriously the idea that it was her role to challenge the Fukuyama thesis. So in the run-up to her party conference speech in October, her political secretary, John Whittingdale, wrote, "She is anxious to rebut the arguments of Francis Fukuyama. She strongly believes that the battle is not won, that there are always evils in the world to be opposed." Now, Margaret Thatcher herself once said, "I came into politics because of the conflict between good and evil." The conflict between good and evil. And she bristled at the idea that these great battles, which she thought structured politics, had come to an end. Now that feeds into a second concern, which was her anxiety about Gorbachev. Thatcher prided herself on being the first Western leader really to engage with Gorbachev. And she was very acutely aware of the risks that he was taking with his reforms. One of the wonderful things about working on Margaret Thatcher is that she was a very expressive annotator of documents. You have a very clear sense of what she's thinking as she's reading. And one of the things that she persistently picked out was any indication that Gorbachev's position might be at risk, that the hardliners in the Kremlin might strike back. Just to give you one example, you can see in a document here, comment, "Gorbachev's German policy would doubtless figure in the indictment against him if he fell." And you can see she double underlines that. She scratched it in the margin. She was genuinely and rightly concerned about the internal politics of the Soviet Union. And that made her really allergic to anything that might endanger his position. She picked him in 1989 as her man of the century for Time magazine. Not Churchill, not Dennis, but Gorbachev, the man of the century. She told the Wall Street Journal in January 1990, "It is in the interests of everyone who believes in democracy, everyone who believes in human rights, that Mr. Gorbachev continues in power." And she was willing to pay a very high price for that. She told a NATO summit in Malta The West should do nothing to destabilize the Warsaw Pact. This would only cause huge difficulties for President Gorbachev. And I think it's an extraordinary quote. This is the Iron Lady of the West saying we've got to protect and uphold the Warsaw Pact. But I think that's a mark of just how fragile and dangerous she thought this situation was. So we've got the pace of change. We've got the threat to Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. The next big concern was simply the complexity of the task, and particularly in relation to Germany. The reform movement in East Germany posed very different problems to that in Poland or Hungary or Bulgaria, because East Germany had no purpose as a state without communism. To quote one of her Foreign Office briefs, take away ideology and you are left with Germany. So what that meant was that the collapse of communism was always going to put reunification on the agenda. Very few people foresaw how quickly it would do that. But it was going to come as a major political question. And reunification was going to raise big questions for the future of NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and the European community. It also stirred one of Thatcher's less admirable attributes, which was her deep suspicion of Germany. And that suspicion, I think, had been smothered for much of her political career by the greater threat of the Soviet Union. But as the Soviet Union receded, so those anxieties reanimated. She dedicates a whole section of her memoirs to what she calls the German problem. And she doesn't mince her words. She says this: I do not believe in collective guilt, but I do believe in national character. Since the unification of Germany under Bismarck, Germany has veered unpredictably between aggression and self-doubt. She adds rather portentously, the true origin of German angst is the agony of self-knowledge. And those around her became very accustomed to what Douglas Hurd in his diary called, and I quote, the usual diatribe against German selfishness. George Urban, who was a Hungarian emigre who ran Radio Free Europe, he admired Margaret Thatcher tremendously, but he was horrified at what he called her Alf Garnett vision of history. And he would record in his diary some of the things that she would say to him. Once a German, always a German. You can never trust them, and so on. Now, this might have been less of a problem if it was simply in private, but in a series of inflammatory interviews, all of which were read with horror in the Chancellery in Bonn, she suggested that Germany might violate Poland's frontiers. She warned of a resurgence of German nationalism, and she asked rhetorically, what is reunification all about? One people, one fatherland. And again, going back to her annotations, it's noticeable that she consistently picks out any reference to the Second World War. In one meeting with Francois Mitterrand, she astonished him by reaching into her handbag and pulling out maps of Germany's pre-war borders. I must say, if there are any Harry Potter fans in the audience, her handbag seems to have had many of the capabilities of Hermione Granger's bag in Book 7, so anything that she might ever have needed seems to have been down there somewhere. She was egged on in this by her private secretary, Charles Powell. Just to give you an example, this is from a document he wrote for her in February 1990. For the first time in 45 years, Germany is out in front. After decades of sober and cautious diplomacy, they are in the driving seat and Toad is at the wheel. The exhilaration is unmistakable. The Germans' moment has come. They are going to settle their destiny. Now, Powell was also at the centre of one of the most damaging incidents of this period, which was the Chequers seminar of March 1990. Thatcher had invited a group of academics to come to Chequers and to discuss the issues raised by German unification. And Powell produced a really hair-raising summary of their work. You'll get a flavour of it just from this section on the German national character. You can see we've got down here, like the first yellow line, in alphabetical order, angst, aggressiveness, assertiveness, bullying, egotism, inferiority complex, sentimentality, and so on. The top here, It still had to be asked how a cultured and cultivated nation had allowed itself to be brainwashed into barbarism, and the way in which the Germans currently use their elbows and threw their weight about in the European community suggests that a lot had still not changed. Now, Powell wrote at the top of this document, "It would be very embarrassing and gravely damaging if the contents of so frank a discussion were to become known." So naturally, it goes straight to the Independent and causes an international incident. Now, Powell's summary actually seems not to have reflected what was said at that seminar, but it almost certainly did capture Margaret Thatcher's view. In a meeting with Gorbachev in September, she asked for the tape recorder to be turned off so that she could speak her mind. And what she wanted to say was this: "We do not want the unification of Germany. It would lead to changes in the post-war borders, and we cannot allow that." At a summit of Commonwealth leaders in October, her remarks were so inflammatory that the civil servants agreed afterwards to remove them from the official record. And what that reminds us, I think, is that for Thatcher, unification was not only dangerous because of Soviet anxieties or because of the complexity of the problem, it was actively undesirable in its own right. Now, of course, Thatcher was by no means unique in holding these kinds of opinions. She was, after all, of a wartime generation. Francois Mitterrand, who had spent time in a German prison camp, said things in private about Germany that would strip the paint from the walls. He told Thatcher the Germans were turning once again into the bad Germans that they used to be. In many respects, I think Mitterrand's diagnosis of the situation was similar to Thatcher's. Where he differed was on his prescription. So this is from a meeting between the two leaders in January 1990. The president said that he drew the conclusion, and he's just said all sorts of horrible things about Germany, that it would be stupid to say no to reunification. None of us were going to declare war on Germany, nor, judging by his statements, was Mr. Gorbachev. At the end of the day, they could not prevent reunification. So for Mitterrand, the task becomes to welcome unification in public and to work to shape it to France's benefit. Now, that was also what the Foreign Office wanted to do in Britain. Margaret Thatcher thought it was too pessimistic. The Prime Minister did not agree that there was nothing to be done. She thought that we had a stronger hand on reunification than President Mitterrand believed. And as she acknowledges in her memoirs, that was to prove a very serious misjudgment. Thatcher accuses Mitterrand in her memoirs of making the wrong decision for France. But the difference between them was partly that Mitterrand had a solution which Thatcher could not accept. And that was closer integration in Europe. So for Mitterrand, the way to constrain Germany was to bind it in to a more federal Europe, to create a European Germany rather than a German Europe. Now, that was not an approach that appealed to Thatcher. She wrote in the margin of one letter, "The problems will not be overcome by strengthening the EC. Germany's ambitions would then become the dominant and active factor." She told the French Prime Minister, "Tying ourselves more closely to Germany would leave Britain and France even more under her sway." Now, Thatcher was not at this point straightforwardly anti-European. Her government had been one of the driving forces behind the single market. The single market had been spun as Thatcherism on a European scale. Even in the notorious Bruges speech in 1988, she was at pains to say, "Britain does not dream of some cosy, isolated existence on the fringes of the European community. Our destiny is in Europe as part of the community." But what she wasn't was a federalist. And the idea that German unification might accelerate the creation of a federal Europe was another reason, in her view, to try to slow it down. So how did that translate into policy? Well, Thatcher developed two main policy goals. The first was simply to push the very discussion of unification as far down the road as humanly possible. So on the day after the wall opened, she refused to answer when journalists put to her the question of whether unification was on the table. Even when she was asked, "Is a united Germany an idea you could live with within your lifetime?" she replied, "You are going much too fast. You're going much too fast." Later in the month, she suggested it might be 10 or 20 years before the discussion of unification could begin. And she argued that the first task was to establish democracy in East Germany. That had to include, in her view, a stable market economy. Once that market economy had bedded down, it might then be possible to consider future changes. Now, that wasn't an especially outlandish position in the early days. What was unusual about Thatcher was her determination to hold to that as the pace of change began to develop. Once momentum did begin to build towards unification, she tried to deploy every possible diplomatic device to slow it down. She suggested that the Helsinki Accords of 1975, which agreed to respect existing borders, gave all 35 signatories a say in German unification. There's a lovely document where the Foreign Office lawyers say that this is not correct, that this is not an accurate legal interpretation of the Accords. And she writes at the bottom, they must stop putting their names to this kind of nonsense. What emerged instead was the so-called 2+4 process, the 2 Germanys plus the 4 wartime powers. Strikingly, Margaret Thatcher made a point of calling it the 4+2, not the 2+4, to make clear where she thought the power should lie. Her second goal was to try to preserve what she thought of as a traditional British strategic interest. And that was the maintenance of a balance of power in Europe. And she uses that term, the balance of power, a lot in her writings on the subject. Now, achieving that meant reappraising the position of the Soviet Union. So this is what Charles Powell wrote in a memo summarising her views. We have to bear in mind, although not say, that we might one day need the Soviet Union as a counterbalance to a united Germany. And she put that several times. She also very unwisely made that argument to President Bush. In a phone call, she said to him, one had to remember that Germany was surrounded by countries, most of which it had attacked or occupied in the course of this century. Of course, Germany today was very different, but other countries would become alarmed if there was not some sort of counterbalance. In practical terms, and looking well into the future, only the Soviet Union could provide balance in the political sphere. Now, Bush was apparently so appalled by this conversation that he had to go for a long walk afterwards to calm down. And urgent messages began to come back across the Atlantic, reporting the president's view of this. It was reported to her from the Washington embassy that the president found this deeply worrying. He could not conceive how you could think of the Russians as possible allies against Germany. And if you look at the margin there, you can see that she's written next to that 1941 to 1945, which I think says a lot about her mindset at that time. So documents like this are a reminder that when Thatcher talked about preserving the Warsaw Pact and not destabilising the Soviet Union, she wasn't just being sensitive to the position of Gorbachev. She was also trying to uphold a balance of power that could contain Germany. The problem with all of this was threefold. Firstly, like the other Western powers, Britain had been committed to the principle of unification for decades. Thatcher herself, in a joint statement with Kohl in 1984, had said, real and permanent stability in Europe will be difficult to achieve so long as the German nation is divided against its will. And it was quite hard to roll back from that without attracting the charge of hypocrisy. A second problem is that Thatcher was a very good analyst of the dangers of going too fast. She was, I think, much less well attuned to the dangers of not going fast enough. By the start of 1990, the situation in East Germany was becoming dangerously unstable. The economy was close to collapse. Emigration to the West was at untenable levels. 3 elections, which had been scheduled for May, had to be brought forward to March because of fear that the state might actually collapse before it could get there. And the more unstable things became, the greater the danger of an explosion, the greater the danger of some kind of collision with Soviet troops on the ground. So the pace of unification really accelerated, not so much because Toad was at the wheel, but because of the unravelling situation in East Germany itself. Thirdly, Thatcher consistently overestimated Britain's ability to influence what was happening, or indeed the extent to which her own hostile rhetoric was diminishing that influence. It's an obvious point, but mood music matters in diplomacy. And it's a sense that while others were singing the ode to joy, whatever they thought in private, the music that was coming out of number 10 was the Dambusters March. And the effect was to make Britain look not just hostile, but impotent. The British ambassador in Bonn, Christopher Mallaby, wrote to Douglas Hurd, "Britain's public standing in Germany is at its lowest for years. The UK is perceived here as the least positive of the Western Allies and the least important." And there's a lovely document by Nigel Cox, which has a sort of Sir Humphrey Appleby level of understatement, in which he says, "It is just possible that the cumulative effect of some of our actions may have caused a little irritation in Bonn." But it's not just coming from Bonn. The British Embassy in Washington warns the Foreign Office that President Bush was accustomed to, but deeply uncomfortable with, the Prime Minister's dismissive references to the Germans. He warns that a negative attitude to unification would diminish our ability to guide discussion and to influence the Americans. And similar messages came from Paris and from Rome. And a consistent theme of these dispatches was that prime ministerial rhetoric was overshadowing the much more constructive role that Britain was actually playing. Now, of course, none of this had much impact on unification. It went ahead on the 3rd of October 1990. Strikingly, both Bush and Mitterrand filmed personal messages of congratulation. Margaret Thatcher did not. So what did all of this mean for Britain? Well, firstly, I think it left Margaret Thatcher weaker at home. Even the Daily Mail thought that her attitude had been too grudging and futilely so. And it made this quite interesting comment in an editorial. "The successes of the 1980s came about because we were led by a lady who refused to contemplate failure. How tragic that this could all be lost by a Prime Minister whose faith in the future is paralysed by her fears of the past." That's the Daily Mail. And similar noises were coming from the Conservative backbenchers. When Thatcher's campaign team sat round to discuss the leadership contest in 1989, one of them summed up a sort of theme of much of the comments that he was getting from backbenchers. "She has been magnificent in the 1980s, but she is not for the 1990s. Now, that was a dangerous perception because I think it really did speak to a change in the political climate. Thatcher had always seen herself very much as a war leader. That's something that's captured in quite a lot of the artwork of the period. Britain's fighting lady, or over here, sort of Margaret Thatcher as a combination of Joan of Arc, Boadicea, and the Terminator. She was never happier than driving around in a tank. And I think that image of a Prime Minister riding into battle made a lot of sense in the very combative politics of the 1970s. The sense of a Prime Minister who was playing the role of St. George against the dragons of strikes, socialism, and the Soviet Union. But I think the restless search for new dragons to slay, or what seemed to most observers to be a time of hope, that clearly alarmed many of her supporters. Voters do not always favour war leaders in a time of peace. And it might be no coincidence that in 1990, as in 1945, the end of hostilities saw a war leader replaced by a rather more emollient and less combative figure. The controversy around German unification also entrenched one of the great political shifts of the last 3 decades, which is the rise of conservative Euroscepticism. It was, of course, the Conservative Party that had taken Britain into the European community in the first place. Margaret Thatcher's first campaign as party leader was to keep Britain in during the referendum in 1975, wearing her now infamous Yes to Europe jumper. Now that changed for all sorts of different reasons, partly to do with changes in the European Union itself. But German unification is, I think, an important part of this story, because what it did was to accelerate the movement towards political union. It accelerated the movement towards monetary union. It also ultimately made possible the expansion to the east, which changed the debate about freedom of movement. But it also changed what someone like Margaret Thatcher saw when she looked across the English Channel. One of the things that Thatcher had liked about Europe, traditionally, had been the idea that this was a Cold War alliance, that this was something that bound together the states of Western Europe in a free market, anti-communist bloc. Which I think from 1990 onwards, Europe started to look to Margaret Thatcher less like a bulwark against communism and more like a vehicle for German influence. And that speaks to my final point, which is about the place of the Cold War in British history. I actually don't think we pay enough attention as historians to the way that the Cold War structured British politics, and in particular, the way that it structured conservatism. For most of the 20th century, the central pin of conservative politics was its opposition to socialism and its ability to associate socialism with a hostile foreign power. And that formed a kind of magnetic field that could bind together free marketeers, conservative anti-revolutionaries, one nation social reformers, British nationalists, Tory pro-Europeans. What the decline of the Soviet Union did was to strip conservatism of that magnetic core, which meant that those different traditions started to pull in different directions. And it's striking, I think, that the Conservative Party has never been as united or as electorally successful since the end of the Soviet Union. In that respect, we might say that the end of the Cold War marks an epoch in Britain, as well as on the continent, that it marks the close of a distinct era in British politics. It's striking, I think, that on the day of the leadership challenge in 1990 that ended Margaret Thatcher's premiership, she was actually in Paris signing the treaties that helped to end the Cold War. And it's perhaps no coincidence that as communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, and as a particular phase of history came to an end, so the Iron Curtain should have fallen in Britain on the career of the Iron Lady. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for such a fantastic John Antcliffe Memorial Lecture. I'd now like to open the floor for questions. We do have a roving mic, but the geography of the room doesn't really suit it. So if you could just raise your voice, perhaps introduce yourself and keep your question short and in the form of a question, that would be great. Thank you. Yes.
Adrian Williamson. I was just wondering. Adrian Williamson. I was just wondering, how does the debate over the ERM fit into your story? Because Thatcher has stood out against the ERM. Eventually, against her better judgment, the UK has gone in, and in I think June of 1990, Nick Ridley is sacked for comparing Helmut Kohl to Hitler. So I'm just wondering how that fits into your broader story about German reunification.
I think it's very much part of the same story, that when I talked about that core alliance of Thatcherism splitting apart, of Margaret Thatcher finding herself at war with Nigel Lawson and Geoffrey Howe, of course the key issue there was about the ERM and about Britain's relationship with the European community, in the sense that Thatcherism itself was fracturing on the question of how to respond to a more rapidly integrating Europe. And I think Thatcher recognised that German unification was going to make it much harder to resist. You know, of course, one of the first stages of German unification was monetary union between East and West. And the idea that if you didn't want the Deutschmark to become the dominant currency of Europe, you had to create a European currency that would replace it. So immediately there's a sense of an accelerating drive towards European monetary union. So I think that the two are very much part of the same story. I bored everyone into submission.
Sorry, Glenn.
There is also another war going on at this very moment, of course, in which Thatcher does play a significant role. In August, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait leads to Margaret Thatcher being a significant advocate for a militarised response to Iraq's invasion, in particular in her relations with Bush. Does that figure in the story of the wartime leader, or the war leader, as it were, who is unable to, in some ways, characterise that as being in accordance with the spirit of the time? Or in some ways, is that a distraction from the story that you are telling?
No, it's interesting. In Margaret Thatcher's memoirs, she talks about George Bush's claim that West Germany was America's partner in leadership in Europe. And she says something like, that would be a very compelling idea if you were willing to ignore history, tradition, politics, and the economy. And she goes on to what an absurd idea this was. And her proof of this is the Iraq War. That actually at the moment that America needs its allies, where's West Germany? It's Britain that's out there fighting in Iraq and standing alongside it diplomatically. So she viewed the Iraq War as evidence that Bush's model of a sort of post-special relationship diplomacy was fundamentally flawed. I think the problem with that is, I think there is a danger for a country of the sort of scale of Britain in getting to a situation in which what makes it useful to the United States is its willingness to go and fight alongside it. And that, you know, that might well be an important part of a relationship, but if that starts to come to be seen as the linchpin of your relationship, then I think you have a problem. And I think, of course, much more famously in the Second Iraq War, one of the calculations was what would it mean for Britain's capacity to influence the United States if Britain stayed outside. And in that respect, I think the loss of other forms of influence in this difficult moment of the reordering of the post-Cold War world is a major problem, in which the First Iraq War sends a misleading signal.
Thank you. I'll speak without the microphone. I think it's easier. Julie Smith, Hollis, and on the Lib Dem benches in the House of Lords. But during the referendum, I had the opportunity to keep debating Nigel Lawson. The picture you had there of Geoffrey Howe, Margaret Thatcher, and Nigel Lawson. You rightly said Lawson and Howe were on the other side of history in the 1980s, and yet in the referendum, Nigel Lawson was passionately campaigning to leave, and if Margaret Thatcher had been alive, she would have been campaigning to leave as well. How did their legacies come back together, do you think?
It's a really interesting question. I think you would need to know more about Nigel Lawson than I do in order to be able to answer that. I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting about Lawson is that, and one thing that made him such a formidable figure in the Thatcher cabinets, was that he was always very intellectually lively and interested and sort of combative and exploratory. And I think because of that, his politics have probably changed more over the course of his career than someone like Margaret Thatcher's did. So I think there may be a greater fluidity to his politics. But also I think a key point is that the battle that he and Geoffrey Howe were fighting with Margaret Thatcher was over the ERM. It was not over European monetary union. And for Lawson in particular, there was a big divide between those two things. That the idea that you create an exchange rate mechanism which becomes an anti-inflationary device was something he was very supportive of. The idea you have a single currency, even at that point, he was very strongly opposed to. So, part of the story here, of course, is about how Europe changes, how what the European Union is changes, and how that moves people around the battlefield.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, hi there. I'm Stephen Meredith, and I think I can speak loudly enough not to use the microphone as well. Just really interested by your kind of sort of discussion of Margaret Thatcher's response to Fukuyama's very, very influential article. On one hand, you might have thought there was some sort of natural ideological affinity with his flawed argument, in the sense, as many others have argued, there's always going to be an enemy or another. You then went on to say that Thatcher saw the reconstituted Soviet Union as a counterbalance to a potentially united Germany. Was the united Germany the new other?
The new other in Thatcher's thoughts?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or what were the others that Thatcher kind of criticised Fukuyama about?
So it's one of the wonderful things, like, so commend this to everybody, if you're interested in Margaret Thatcher, is the Margaret Thatcher Foundation website, which operates obviously out of Churchill College, which just has hundreds of thousands of documents freely digitised. And you can actually read Margaret Thatcher's copy of Fukuyama's End of History, and you can see her annotating it as she goes. And you're absolutely right, she's loving lots of it.
Yes, okay.
You know, when he talks about how socialism is a collapsed ideology that is totally unsuited to the modern world, she's very on board with all of that. She's on board with quite a lot of the things that he says. Where she suddenly hits the buffers is the idea that ideological conflict has ended. And I think it's very important to Thatcher's model of politics that there is always this collision, that politics is a form of war by other means. And I think that's one of the things that makes her politics increasingly problematic to her party, is there's a sense that she's looking after 1989 for new enemies. Yes. The Soviet Union won't play that role anymore. Yes. So who is it? And in some respects she's quite prescient, actually. She talks about international terrorism quite early on. She talks about Islamic fundamentalism as being a problem with which the West is going to have to engage. But she's also absolutely looking for Germany.
Okay.
And it's interesting that there was an end-of-year big Gallup poll on, which asked all sorts of questions about international relations. And one of the questions it asked the public was, who do you think Britain's main enemy will be in 10 years' time? And there isn't really any sense, actually, of coherence about the answer. By a distance, the highest is don't know. And then I think it's China and Japan. And the bottom of all the options they were given, the one that fewest people chose was Germany. In that sense, Margaret Thatcher's identification of Germany as an enemy for Britain in the future, I think was very much out of step with public opinion.
Yes, at the back in the corner.
Jonathan Knight, this is perhaps slightly fanciful, but can you speculate how Thatcher would have got on with Angela Merkel?
Good gracious. Yes. She tended not to, with the occasional exception, she tended not to get on terribly well with other female leaders. And I think that might have been a problem. And I think there would be aspects of Merkel that she would have admired. The sense of someone who's not flashy, who's very diligent, who works very hard. These would all have been the kind of attributes that Mrs. Thatcher liked. But I think the sense of the kind of role that Merkel was given by a lot of public opinion in Europe, the sense of Merkel as the sort of presiding figure of European liberalism, would have been a vision that Mrs. Thatcher found very unattractive. I think there's some students. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Meg Young, University of Washington. Thanks, great talk. You provided that quote about the sense that her policy was failed. I was wondering if you could please unpack that a little bit more by telling us if she felt that she was wrong in retrospect and what she felt she could have done differently.
So in her memoirs, she says, the policy failed, but I do not think the policy was wrong. And she goes on to explain why. And she restates the argument in favour of, she moderates it slightly in her memoirs. It becomes more about slowing unification down and doing it with greater caution. But she still pushes that line very hard. And it's striking, actually, how much she hits out at other world leaders in that section of her memoirs. I quoted her saying that Mitterrand made the wrong decision for France. She was also highly critical of Bush for supporting this process and supporting European integration. She's actually very critical of Gorbachev in her memoirs at that point, for as she sees it extracting too low a price from West Germany. Because one of the things that oiled the wheels here was simply that West Germany helped the Soviet Union out financially, and she felt they could have asked for a lot more. And she's very explicit about that. Her memoirs are a really interesting read because there is a certain restraint that's gone by that stage, now that she's out of power. And she says, I knew I was right, and that her task was to convince everybody else of that fact.
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, this chap's had
Oh,
this.
sorry, yes.
Hi there, Alfie Faraday. I was wondering to what extent sort of party politics plays a role in this discussion. So obviously, the picture here is very much within government between how Lawson, Thatcher. But I was wondering if the Labour Party concerns about that played a role in Thatcher's thinking, or if, after the issue, after the policy fails, does Labour exploit this in any way?
Yes, I mean, there's a sort of, this particular episode is part of a bigger package, of course, of all sorts of international changes taking place, which are generally being regarded as a good thing, to which Mrs. Thatcher appears to be hostile. Another would be the release of Nelson Mandela, which is a really interesting story in its own right, in that actually for years, privately, she and her government had been pushing Pretoria very hard for the release of Nelson Mandela. This was a policy outcome that she had wanted, and yet when it actually happens, her response tends to be very critical of his economic policy, to talk about what a disappointment he had been in his remarks on communism. And so Labour is able to make great hay with the idea that wonderful things are happening in the world. And Kinnock actually even tries to associate himself to a certain extent with Gorbachev, with the idea of a kind of reformed socialism, that's about freedom, that embraces to a certain extent the market. So Labour does work quite hard, I'm not sure how successfully, to try to position itself as the party that supports these kind of manoeuvres. One of the concerns that Thatcher does express about a united Germany is that it might become a socialist Germany. What if the SDP, what if the influence of voters in East Germany is to carry into this united Germany a kind of communist socialist politics that will actually drag Germany further to the left? So there is some concern about that.
Paul Ramsey, could you say a bit more about Thatcher's understanding of British power, and in particular the tools available to Britain in terms of soft and hard power, and how they affect her view? It seems to me that perhaps there's two contrary things going on there in the paper. You said on the one hand, the major thing she didn't understand was Britain's declining power in the situation as it was, but at the same time she was extremely concerned about the balance of power, so power itself. So I wonder how those two things come together.
It's a really interesting question. I think a problem that can happen to a lot of prime ministers when they stay in office for a very long time is that they read too much into their successors. And I think Thatcher's diplomacy and perhaps her understanding of how Britain exerted power in the world had changed. One thing she was very proud of by 1989 was the idea that she had restored British power in the world, the idea that Britain was taken seriously in the world in a way that it hadn't been in 1979. But the diplomatic successes that she tends to hark back to are not things like Rhodesia, which have been achieved by quite an interesting process of careful diplomacy. It's things like getting the rebate back, getting our money back from Europe by being bellicose and obstinate. Or it's the Falklands War. The Falklands War, I think, again, teaches a dangerously misread lesson that what really matters is sort of guts and determination. The idea that if you have the courage to do something, then you will succeed. And that is sometimes true. There's no doubt that courage and guts are an important part of diplomacy. But you have to have the kind of tools of power in order to back them up. And I think she found it difficult to appreciate by 1989 that these kind of tactics of obstruction, of fierce public rhetoric, were actually not producing the outcome that she wanted.
Yes.
So, I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room who's listening to you and thinking of our current predicament. That is to say, how our opinions formed and how can people, can prime ministers change their minds? And if so, who helps them reflect critically on their practices? So we know that Angela Merkel is an avid reader of Chris Clark's books, and he's been to all members of the cabinet and believes in sort of reading and discussing. I'm just wondering, from working through all the Thatcher work, because she's so diligent and she's so, in a way, she's intellectually engaged, and yet the opinions are both out of step with the British public, as we say, and also, except for the Fukuyama, really not. I mean, I'm just wondering what she's reading, who she's talking to, or was there, could someone have sort of led her elsewhere in terms of understanding this frightening new hopeful world?
I think one of the things that's actually impressive about Margaret Thatcher, when you read back through the archive, is how intellectually engaged she was. I'm not sure how many prime ministers would actually read Fukuyama on the end of history and take notes on it as they went. And that's very, very Margaret Thatcher. And the fact that she held the Chequers, the seminar at Chequers, where she invited Tim Garton-Ash and Lord Dacre and Norman Stone and George Urban to come and, the idea to bring expert historians of Germany to Chequers to inform her, was really quite impressive. The problem is, if you read the accounts of the summit, of the seminar at Chequers, what it very quickly turns into is a kind of war, that, she knows what her opinion is and is daring people to tell her that she's wrong. And actually, when people did so, she was often quite responsive to that. It's one of the reasons why, for a period, her relationship with Lawson worked very well, because somebody who stood up to her could actually have an impact. But, especially by 1989, she's in some ways the most prestigious figure in, Western politics. She's the Prime Minister of 10 years standing. The number of people who are willing to really roar into battle against her is quite small. There's a really interesting memo by William Waldegrave when he was a Foreign Office Minister. And he says, I'm really impressed by the quality of the dispatches coming out of the Foreign Office. I am less impressed by the tactics being used in relation to number 10. He says, we have to stop telling the Prime Minister what she wants to hear. We have to stop trying to sugarcoat things that we're frightened she's going to be cross about. This is the time for plain speaking. And there's a memo from another, one of the permanent secretaries, who says, I think this is the time for surgery, not syrup. But, going up against Margaret Thatcher was a deeply frightening thing to do by that stage. And there weren't that many people, I think, who were willing to do it. And some of those who were willing, she wasn't listening to anymore, like Lawson and Howe.
We're just about out of time. Maybe just one last question, this gentleman here.
Thatcherism as an economic philosophy, if you want to call it that, spread to many parts of the world, and that is how she's remembered in many parts of the world. Do you think that legacy endures?
Her economic legacy? Yes, I do. Though I think Thatcherism is a constantly changing entity, and actually I think it continues to change in quite interesting ways after she leaves power. I think there's a very good article to be written actually about Thatcherism in the 90s, and what people start to take Thatcherism to mean outside its particular context. A context that is shaped by the Cold War, which is acting on a very different economy. One way of thinking about that would be things like privatisation, that most of Margaret Thatcher's privatisations in the 80s can be represented as a rolling back of the state, whereas what seems to be happening from the 90s and beyond is a rolling forward of the market, and that there's a sort of valorisation of competition and market discipline for its own sake, in a way that I don't know about you, but I don't see so much in the 1980s. So I think, we have a single word, Thatcherism, that is consistent across time, but I think a lot of the things that Thatcherites today believe are positions that Margaret Thatcher herself would have found quite surprising in the 1980s.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know there are other questions out there. My apologies. It's inevitable with such a stimulating lecture. Only two pleasant duties remaining to me, and those are first off to invite everyone for a drink next door, but secondly, and most importantly, to thank our fifth John Antcliffe Memorial Lecturer on British Politics, Dr. Robert Saunders. Thank you.